Components are great and all, but what do we do with data or logic that is not associated with a specific view or that we want to share across components? We build services. Welcome back to Angular 2 Getting Started from Pluralsight. Deborah Kurata here, at your service. And in this module, we create a service and use dependency injection to inject that service into any component that needs it. Applications often require services, such as a product data service or a logging service. Our components depend on these services to do the heavy lifting. Wouldn't it be nice if Angular could serve us up those services on a platter? Well, yes it can. But what are services exactly? A service is a class with a focused purpose. We often create a service to implement functionality that is independent from any particular component, to share data or logic across components, or encapsulate external interactions such as data access. By shifting these responsibilities from the component to a service, the code is easier to test, debug, and reuse. In this module, we start with an overview of how services and dependency injection work in Angular. Then we'll build a service, we'll register that service, and we'll examine how to use the service in a component. We currently have several pieces of our application in place, but we hard-coded our data directly in the product list component. In this module, we'll shift the responsibility for providing the product data to a product data service. Let's get started. Before we jump into building a service, let's take a look at how services and dependency injection work in Angular. In this diagram, our service is here, and our component that needs the service is here. There are two ways our component can work with this service. The component can create an instance of the service class and use it. That's simple, and it works. But the instance is local to the component, so we can't share data or other resources, and it will be more difficult to mock the service for testing. Alternatively, we can register the service with Angular. Angular then creates a single instance of the service class, called a singleton, and holds onto it. Specifically, Angular provides a built-in injector. We register our services with the Angular injector, which maintains a container of created service instances. The injector creates and manages the single instance, or singleton, of each registered service as required. In this example, the Angular injector is managing instances of 3 different services: log, math, and myService, which is abbreviated SVC. If our component needs a service, the component class defines the service as a dependency. The Angular injector then provides or injects the service class instance when the component class is instantiated. This process is called dependency injection. Since Angular manages the single instance, any data or logic in that instance is shared by all of the classes that use it. This technique is the recommended way to use services because it provides better management of service instances, it allows sharing of data in other resources, and it's easier to mock the services for testing purposes. Now let's look at a more formal definition of dependency injection. Dependency injection is a coding pattern in which a class receives the instances of objects it needs, called its dependencies, from an external source rather than creating them itself. In Angular, this external source is the Angular injector. Now that we've got a general idea of how services and dependency injection work in Angular, let's build a service. Are we ready to build a service? Here are the steps. Create the service class, define the metadata with the decorator, and import what we need. Look familiar? These are the same basic steps we followed to build our components and our custom pipe. Let's look at the code for a simple service. Here is the class. We export it so this service can be used from any other parts of the application. This class currently has one method, getProducts. This method returns an array of products. Next, we add a decorator for the service metadata. When building services, we often use the injectable decorator. This decorator is only really required here if the service itself has an injected dependency. However, it is recommended that every service class use the injectable decorator for clarity and consistency. Lastly, we import what we need, in this case, injectable. Now let's build our service. I've opened the folder for the sample application in the editor once again. Since our service will only provide product data, we'll add it to the products folder. We'll create a new file and call it product.service.ts to follow our naming conventions. We're then ready to create the service class. I bet you can do it in your sleep by now. Export, class, and the class name. Since the service provides products, we'll call it product service. Next, we decorate the class with the injectable decorator, and we'll add the import statement for that decorator. As we discussed earlier, this decorator is optional unless the service has an injected dependency of its own, but it is good practice to add it to every service, so we added it here. Now that we have the structure in place, we can add properties or methods to the class as needed. Unless marked private or protected, the properties and methods defined in the class are accessible to any class that uses this service. For our product service, we want a getProducts method that returns the list of products. We strongly type this return value using our iProduct interface, so we need to import this interface. In the next module, we'll see how to retrieve the products using HTTP. For now, we'll hard code them in here. If you're coding along, feel free to copy some products from the products.json file in the API products folder. Notice that we have no properties defined in this class, so we are not using this particular service to share data. We are using it to encapsulate the data access features. By using this service to provide the list of products, we take the responsibility for managing the data away from the individual component. That makes it easier to modify or reuse this logic. So we're done with our service for now. How do we use it? Well, a service is just really an ordinary class until we register it with an Angular injector. Let's do that next. As illustrated in this diagram, we register the service with an Angular injector, and the injector provides the service instance to any class that defines it as a dependency. So what's actually involved with registering a service with the injector? To register a service, we must register a provider. A provider is code that can create or return a service, typically the service class itself. How do we register a provider? We define it as part of the component or Angular module metadata. If we register a provider in a component's metadata, the Angular injector can inject the service into the component and any of its children. So we should take care to register the provider at the appropriate level of the application component tree. If we register a provider in an Angular module, the service is registered with the Angular injector at the application's root, making the service available everywhere in the application. We'll talk more about registering a service provider in an Angular module when we cover Angular modules in detail later in this course. For now, we'll focus on registering a service with a component. If we register the provider for the product data service in the product list component, the Angular injector can inject the service into the product list component and any of its children. It could not inject the service into the product detail component unless we registered the provider again in the product detail component. Note that if we did register the provider for the service twice, we would no longer have a singleton. The Angular injector would manage two instances of the service, one for the product list component and its children, another for the product detail component and its children. If instead we register the provider in the root app component, the Angular injector can inject the service into any component of the application. Since we know the product detail component will also need the product data service, let's register it at the root. Here is the app component we built early on in this course. To register a provider that creates our service, we add the provider's property to the component decorator. The provider's property is an array, so we could register multiple providers. To register a provider for our product service, we specify product service here and import it here. Let's do that now. Here is the app component. In the metadata, we'll add the provider's property and specify our product service. So we of course need to import our product service. An instance of the product service is then available for injection in the app component or any of its child components. Now we can specify where we need the service to be injected. Here again is our diagram. In the last clip, we saw how to register the service with the Angular injector. Now we just need to define it as a dependency, so the injector will provide the instance and the classes that need it. So, how do we do dependency injection in Angular? Well, the better question is, how do we do dependency injection in TypeScript? The answer is, in the constructor. Every class has a constructor that is executed when an instance of the class is created. If there is no explicit constructor defined for the class, an implicit constructor is used. So far, we have not needed an explicit class constructor, but if we want to inject dependencies, such as an instance of a service, we need an explicit constructor. In TypeScript, a constructor is defined with a constructor function. What type of code normally goes into the constructor function? As little as possible. Since the constructor function is executed when the component is created, it is primarily used for initialization and not for code that has side effects or takes time to execute. We identify our dependencies by specifying them as parameters to the constructor function, like this. Here we define a private variable to hold the injected service instance. We create another variable as the constructor parameter. When this class is constructed, the Angular injector sets this parameter to the injected instance of the requested service. We then assign the injected service instance to our local variable. We can then use this variable anywhere in our class to access service properties or methods. This is such a common pattern that TypeScript defined a shorthand syntax for all of this code. We simply add the accessor keyword, such as private here, to the constructor parameter. Then this is a shortcut for declaring this variable, defining a parameter, and setting the variable to the parameter. Neat! You'll see this technique used throughout the Angular documentation and other code examples. Ready to give it a try? We want to use our service to get products in the product list component. So we'll define our product service as a dependency in the product list component. We don't have to add the providers array here because the product service is already registered in the app component, which is the parent of this component. All we need is a constructor. The constructor is normally defined after all the properties, so we'll add it here. We'll use the shorthand syntax to define the dependency. Private underscore product service. We use an underscore here to denote that this is a private variable. Then, because we are using TypeScript, we type colon and the type, which is product service. Note that the accessor doesn't have to be private. This shorthand syntax works with public and protected as well. So now we have a syntax error here. I bet you know why. Yep, we need to import product service so we can use it as the data type here. Now, when an instance of the product list component is created, the Angular injector injects in the instance of the product service. We are at the point now where we can actually use the product service. First, let's delete the hard-coded products from here. We'll instead get them from the service. Now the question is, where should we put the code to call the service? One thought might be to put it in the constructor. But ultimately, our product service will go out to a back-end server to get the data. We don't want all of that executed in the constructor. Other thoughts? Remember our discussion about lifecycle hooks? Earlier in this course, we said that the OnInit lifecycle hook provides a place to perform any component initialization, and it's a great place to retrieve the data for the template. Let's use the OnInit lifecycle hook. We want to set the product's property to the product's returned from our service. To call the service, we use our private variable containing the injected server instance, this ._product service. We then type a dot and the name of the method we want to call. Notice how IntelliSense helps us with all of this. Let's make one more little change. Let's remove the default list filter value so we'll see all of the products in the list. We should be all set to see our result in the browser. And here are our products. Yay! Notice that we have more products displayed now because I hard-coded more products into the service. Let's finish up this module with some checklists we can use as we build our services. We build a service using the same techniques as when we build components and custom pipes. We start by creating the service class. We specify a clear class name appropriate for the services it provides. Use Pascal casing where each word of the name is capitalized. Append service to the name, and don't forget the export keyword. We then decorate the service class with the injectable decorator. Don't forget the @ prefix, and since the decorator is a function, follow it with open and closing parentheses. This particular decorator is not always required, but it is a good practice to add it. And be sure to define the appropriate imports. We can register a service in a component or in an Angular module. We'll talk more about registering services in Angular modules later in this course. When using a component, the first step to registering the service is to select the appropriate level in the component hierarchy that the service should be registered. Use the root app component if the service is shared throughout the application. If only one component needs the service, register it directly within that component. Otherwise, select a common ancestor of the components that need the service. In the selected component's metadata, use the provider's property to register the service. Pass the service provider as an element of an array, and be sure to define the appropriate imports. In any class that needs the service, specify the service as a dependency. Use a constructor parameter to define the dependency. The Angular injector will inject an instance of the service when the component is instantiated. This module was all about services. We began with an overview of how services and dependency injection work in Angular. Then we walked through how to build a simple service. We defined how and where to register the service with Angular, and we examined how to define the service as a dependency so the service instance is injected into any class that needs it. In this module, we built the product data service and registered it with the app component. So our product list component no longer has hard-coded products. Next up, we'll see how to modify the service to retrieve data using HTTP.